Hello, everyone. How are you? Hi, Dolores. Hi, Carmen. Hi, Kay. I'm so glad you got a notice again tonight, Kay. And thank you for sharing, Dolores. And Steve says, PSA, all previously unscheduled shitlib hashtag puppet shows on the steps in the future have been canceled due to COVID. Read Susan Sarandon. Joy Ramsey says, hello. How are you, Joy? Nice to see you. And Liesel Girl, hello to you. And Liesel says, hi, Carmen, as well. Deborah Wilson says, hi. Hello, Deborah. Glad to see you. And Lana, great to see you as well. Please, everybody, share as much as you can. So I get some people coming to hear my words of wisdom. And to see me in my new red beret. Very important. Very, very important. Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about the state of play of MMT in Washington. But before that, I'm going to try to cover very quickly some news, which is important. Yeah, there's good news on MMT in Washington, I think. And Lisa greets Lana, and Lana says, I do not get any notification. I always have to search for you. Lana, I tweeted out my tweet of the show tonight. The first thing on my tweet was at Organic Fanatic 5. I don't know why you didn't get a Twitter notification. There has to be one somewhere. I know that got out because I think Dolores shared it fairly quickly. And Lana says, hey, Lisa, hey, Carmen. So I don't know what's going on there, folks. It must be some kind of glitch at some other end, not my end. Okay, onward to the news then. Let's start sharing it. First, there's Biden. People finally beginning to say, I say finally because it's been obvious to me from the beginning. I don't know how many times I've covered it. Biden could get more aggressive about the Delta variant, for our sake and his. Yes, for our sake. Entirely for our sake. But maybe for his also. So it's not entirely for our sake. So I guess I agree with the headline, right? It's by David Farris at The Week, August 25th, 2021. So I've been sitting on it for a few days. It says, it mentions Afghanistan, but it then says, what is really exerting downward pressure on Biden's approval rating and by extension his party chances in next year's midterm elections is the dispiriting resurgence of the COVID-19 pandemic. I partly agree. I think if Biden had quit all the bipartisan crap and immediately passed infrastructure bills with heavy pressure on the dissenters and brooking no opposition whatsoever, made it clear he was going to run against them. If they so much as breathed in opposition to his bills, I think he could have gotten the infrastructure bill passed months ago. And then his approval rating would be far higher than it is now. And of course, it's still possible his approval rating is going to shoot up if the $3.5 trillion bill is passed. But yes, there is a problem with COVID, with the pandemic, specifically with the variant, as the author says, an insanely transmissible coronavirus variant, appearing to threaten another long winter of discontent and death. If the president doesn't want the hated Delta variant take his presidency down with him, he needs to get ahead of both the virus and the narrative. Can't wave a magic wand and see all this go away. because even aggressive actions today will take weeks to bear fruit. But the federal government has powers and tools it has yet to deploy, and it needs to do so yesterday. The most pressing is to instruct the FDA to issue an emergency use authorization for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines to be administered to children under 12. If some parents want to play wait and see with additional safety data, they should be given time before mandates are put into place. For those of us who would rather take our chances with unlikely side effects than with our irreplaceable children getting COVID, we should also have that choice. I'd go even farther, and I would say there should be vaccine passports. And if people don't have the vaccine, they don't get into places where they can spread COVID to anybody else. I know all the libertarian arguments, blah, 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 blah. But your rights end where my nose begins. You don't have a right to come into a place where other people are and to spread COVID there. You just don't have that right, in my view. I'm not saying you should be forced to take any vaccine, but I am saying if you want to exercise your choice not to take the vaccine, then others should not be made to pay for that choice. So you should have to give up certain other freedoms in return for exercising your freedom to take the vaccine. Again, you have no right to jeopardize others by not taking the vaccine. Millions of unvaccinated children are being sent to a meat grinder this fall thanks to America's anti-vaxxers. Yes, they are. And demoralized parents don't know what to do they? Should they expose their children? Should they keep them out of school? Should they violate the directives of states and local governments saying the kids ought to go back? It's a terrible dilemma. I'm very lucky I don't have children of school age anymore, because in the present circumstance, I would certainly keep them home, come what may, without vaccinations to protect them. President Biden also must keep one eye on politics, says Farris. His average job approval ratings are at their low point, and most of the decline preceded the missteps in Afghanistan. Given the failure of Democratic majorities in Congress to implement democracy reforms like nonpartisan redistricting, the party really has no shot at holding the House of Representatives if Biden's approval rating is not well over 50%. Today, it's at 48.5. Yeah, I think it's got to be 65% if they're going to hold Congress. Widespread societal malaise and weariness with the pandemic, if it is not addressed head-on, will bring that number even lower. It's great news for beleaguered parents that Biden's Department of Education will be pushing back against bans on vaccine mandates and mask requirements in red states. But these actions aren't going to be on the radar of ordinary people, so that's probably not going to do them any good in terms of the Democratic quest to retain their control over Congress. Schedule a national address about the Delta crisis. Make sure every viewer knows exactly who is to blame for their ongoing hell. Get the families of dead conservative anti-vaxxer media personalities like radio host Phil Valentine on a series of graphic public service announcements, PSAs, begging people to get the jab. There's a role for Congress here, too, to cover the workers who are skipping the vaccine because of workplace policies or out of fear that side effects will keep them home for a few days. Okay, so maybe the U.S. needs special COVID vaccine 6 days, at least 2 days off by law for all 3 shots that the government now says are needed. Additional tax incentives could be offered to companies and institutions that that make vaccinations mandatory for all employees. New policies could be enacted, which make it impossible to take out a federal loan to attend colleges and universities that don't require everyone on campus to show proof of vaccination. Or for a $1,000 tax rebate to anyone who can prove they got the vaccine. This is hardly an exhaustive list. The point is, when they are finished playing their month-long game of footsie with the Republicans, they ought to get down to business and do these kinds of things. Okay, so this guy is saying something aggressive has to be done. But not only him. People are starting to talk about shutdowns again. On Status 2 today, but today Jordan Chariton was talking with he was talking with Walker Bragman, okay, of the Daily Poster, and also Jen Perelman, but concerning what ought to be done. Both of them were in favor of much more active shutdown methods when there were breakouts of COVID. And there was a lot of talk referencing the experience of South Korea and also New Zealand. And Walker Bragman happened to say, look at New Zealand. They've done a terrific job. They've done a really fine job. They've only had less than 1,000 fatalities. Then later he corrected fatalities. They've been really successful. They have been really successful. Me, it seems worth it to mention that a breakout, okay, in New Zealand of COVID let me find it, folks. I'm almost there. They still have only 5 deaths per million. They still have only 26 deaths. So they're not even close to, because they have had 26 deaths forever. You can see the spike of active cases, okay, in New Zealand on the graph. I guess you can't see it because, stupid me, I'm not sharing it. So I'm going to share that for you right now. And then you can see what I see. How's that go? Do you see what I see? Here we go. You can see total cases in New Zealand, sorry, not New England. Total cases, okay, in New Zealand now for all the time of COVID, only 3,569 cases out of 5 million people. Very, very low frequency. Why? Because whenever it pops up, they smack it down. But you can see in the daily new cases, you can see spikes at the start and smaller spikes as you go down. 14 cases, 9 daily cases, 16 daily cases, smack down again to 8, to 4, to what is this, to 9, 18, 20. More recently, all of a sudden, a big spike, 24, 38, 42, 55 cases, 84 cases, 84 cases. The all-time peak in cases was 146. They're now up to 84. So a big spike. Guess what? Not only did they slap it down, they successfully treated people and they haven't had a death since February 15th of 2021, February 16th of 2021, when they rose from 25 to 26 deaths. Since then, not a single additional death, even in the present situation. New Zealand's enormously successful. How do they do that? Every time there is community spread, they quarantine, they isolate the area, they get people to stay indoors, they test, they stamp it out, totally stamp it out.
They won't take chances.
They don't take chances. That's why they've got 5 deaths per million. They've got 5 deaths per million because their prime minister is Jacinda Ardern, who has handled COVID with an iron hand, take no prisoners policy. She's done one of the best jobs in the world on this. It's a society that normally operates. In other words, because they've stamped it out, they're back to normal. People go around without masks in much of the country. They live normal lives most of the time. Occasionally, when there's an outbreak, they quickly stamp it out. 2 or 3 weeks, it's gone. They don't have many vaccines in that country yet. Not many have taken vaccines. Still, only 5 deaths per million. We're something like 2,000 deaths per million. That's how bad we are compared to New Zealand. Always good to remind people about that, and I'm reminding you about that. So, let's go on. The second of our news items. Guess what? There was a SCOTUS attack on Roe v. Wade. That is to say, it's from Common Dreams, by the way. National laws needed, say defenders of women, after SCOTUS attack on Roe. That is, Texas passed a law, an extreme anti-choice law. On Tuesday night, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to block the Texas extreme anti-choice law. Legal experts and rights advocates urged lawmakers to focus on what can be done to protect by reproductive rights across the country, particularly the passage of the Women's Health Protection Act. Finally, there's sentiment in Congress to do something about this. How many years has it been since Roe? They had all this time to pass laws to protect the reproductive rights of women, and they've not done it. They always had more important business than to do that. Now, the Supreme Court could still act to suspend the Texas law, but advocates, including Representative Rosa DeLauro, Democrat of Connecticut, said the inaction displayed on Tuesday showed the 9 justices, 5 of whom were appointed by Republican presidents who lost the popular vote, quote, cannot be trusted to protect the constitutional right to choose. It is up to Congress to pass the Women's Health Protection Act to end this assault on reproductive freedom once and for all, said Rosa DeLauro. I couldn't agree more. The legislation was reintroduced in June by Senators Blumenthal, Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin, and Representatives Judy Chu, Frankel, also Ayanna Pressley, and Veronica Escobar of Texas in the House, and would protect the right to abortion care at the federal level in the event that the Supreme Court fails to protect the Roe v. Wade. Without federal legislation protecting reproductive rights, states including Georgia, Ohio, and Texas have been able to pass increasingly extreme anti-choice laws in recent years. Senate Bill 8 in Texas, which went into effect just after midnight on Wednesday due to the High Court's inaction, bans abortion care after 6 weeks of presidency before most women know they are pregnant, and empowers any private citizen to file a legal challenge against anyone who helps a patient to obtain an abortion. Informing on your fellow citizens, not just informing, you file legal action against your fellow citizens. Amazing. Texas, Republican-led legislature's assault on women's rights, quote, won't stop with Texas, unquote, said abortion justice group. But all above all. So that's the news. Senator Warren posted a video in which he called for a congressional solution to ensure women have the right to obtain abortions. And there she is, and she's calling for that the rule of Roe v. Wade should be law. Along with the need to federally protect voting rights, as Republican legislatures across the country pass dozens of voter suppression laws. This is another reason for the Democratic Party to act by first eliminating the filibuster. The right to an abortion is negotiable, said Pennsylvania Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman. It's obvious we can't rely on the Supreme Court to protect Roe, that Democrats in Washington must act. And he added, of course, he's not in the Senate yet. He's running for the Senate, John Fetterman. He added, Democrats in Congress, quote, should vote like Democrats and scrap the filibuster and pass the Women's Health Protection Act immediately. Another thing that the filibuster, is protecting is these state laws that are taking away the right of choice for women. Choice, most important. Harvard Law School professor Nico Bowie noted that Biden, during his 2020 campaign, vowed to work to make sure the protections of Roe would be codified through legislation. Okay, he did promise that, right? He released a statement Wednesday afternoon saying his administration, quote, is deeply committed to the constitutional right established in Roe v. Wade 5 decades ago, and will protect and defend that right. How are you going to protect and defend it if you don't get a law passed? Advocates called on Democratic leaders to commit to specific steps they'll take to protect abortion rights, including filibuster reform and expanding the Supreme Court, and to take swift action. Expanding the Supreme Court is too controversial and will not happen in a short time. What can happen is filibuster reform. This could spur filibuster reform if there's a real movement to protect the rights, of women. If women insist and get on the streets for this, there's going to have to be filibuster reform. About expanding the Supreme Court, that's going to be harder to pass. We don't have to pass the Supreme Court to safeguard these rights. All we have to do is strip the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court using Article 3, Section 2 from reviewing the act that protects the rights of women enshrined in Roe v. Wade. That's all we have to do to deal the Supreme Court out of it and protect ourselves against the crazy Federalist Society majority in the Supreme Court. These people are ideologues and they are nuts. So that's it for that one. And let's go quickly to the third thing I wanted to cover, which will be fairly brief. Let me share my screen for that. That's an article from Politico. By Victoria Guida. And it was on August 30th. And she calls out Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Rashida Tlaib and Ayanna Pressley, pointing out on Monday they called for Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, otherwise known as Jay Powell, to be replaced, stepping up the pressure on President Joe Biden as he draws closer to a decision on the government's most important economic post. A statement opposing Powell by the high-profile progressive Democrats is part of a mounting effort on the left to urge Biden to reshape the Fed, though the prospect of Powell's reappointment has split opinion among liberal advocates and lawmakers. As news of the possible reappointment of Fed Chair Powell circulates, we urge Biden to imagine a Federal Reserve focused on eliminating climate risk and advancing racial and economic justice. The lawmakers said in a joint statement to Politico, quote, "We urge the Biden administration to use this opportunity to appoint a new Fed chair." They acknowledge Powell has made some positive changes, but said they want to see someone at the helm who's more aggressive on financial regulation and climate change. So that's the story. So if they were able to get that, if they were able to get someone who would be very sensitive to the IPCC and its warning of the potential catastrophic and irreversible damage inflicted by a changing climate, who could they get? Well, the speculation is that Powell's successor would be Lael Brainard, a current member of the Fed board, who we expect to continue what Democrats like about Powell's interest rate policy while being closer to their stance on issues such as climate change and financial regulation. 22 liberal groups joined together to urge Biden to pick Fed leaders who will shift the central bank approach on these same issues, though they stopped short of opposing Powell by name. The latter implicitly nodded to the possibility Biden might name an aggressive person to regulate, to replace outgoing Vice Chair of Supervision Randall Quarles, who doesn't regulate. And they say, "We encourage you to remember the Fed is a hierarchical institution in which the Vice Chair and Vice Chair for Supervision wield considerable agenda-setting powers, but are ultimately deferential to the initiatives of the chair." So they're saying the chair has to be replaced, okay, as well. So a little speculation, who's in line? Well, the people who are said to be in are two, specifically Lael Brainard, as I mentioned, and the other one who is often mentioned is Sarah Bloom Raskin. And Sarah Bloom Raskin is a very good candidate from a progressive standpoint. She is actually more progressive than Brainard. Okay, someone else who I think should be considered is Jamie Galbraith. But Jamie Galbraith and Brainard Sarah Bloom Raskin, okay, are close. In fact, he has been something of a mentor, okay, to Raskin for many years now, and I think that he's also socially close to her. Should be noted, she is the wife of Jamie Raskin, who is a lawmaker on the CPC and very prominent in the CPC, and also very progressive, one of the more progressive people in Congress. Okay. But Sarah Bloom Raskin herself has always been progressive in her financial jobs. She's been the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, and she's also been on the Board of Governors for the Fed. So she has experience in both of the institutions, which are very important for the economy. We should note Sarah Bloom Raskin and Jamie Galbraith are both well connected to Stephanie Kelton. I'm not going into details of some of the details in terms of the connection. All I'll say is that Jamie Galbraith has pushed them both forward, okay, in their careers, and he's put them together in certain contexts, okay, in circles. So it's easy to imagine phone calls among the three of them in order to discuss how Fed policies and Fed practices should be changed. That would be very good for the progressive side. Okay, in Brainard's case, she has been trending towards the left now for a number of years, but in my view, Larry Summers still holds some sway with her. At one time, she was fairly close to Larry Summers. She's not as close as she has been, but he still would have some influence with her. His influence in relation to the Fed would not be good influence. It would favor Wall Street. It would be a baleful influence. On the other hand, he holds no sway with Raskin and no sway with Galbraith, the other two people who I think should be seriously considered for Fed chair. Okay, so that covers some of the news items I wanted to cover here tonight. For the rest of the night, what I would like to do is go through as much of a piece as we can possibly get through, that piece being a new e-pamphlet by Randy Ray, L. Randall Ray, one of the big three, okay, of MMT. If you talk about a big four of MMT, then Stephanie Kelton would have to be in the big four. But the previous big three were actually Warren Mosler, Bill Mitchell, and Randy Ray. And Randy Ray is co-author of the macroeconomics textbook, the first one that actually presents, okay, an MMT approach. A wonderful, wonderful textbook. This paper I'm about to share is one that in a fairly, it's not a brief read, but it is, okay, it's a 34-page read. Okay, so it's not so brief. But considering that it's only 34 pages, it crams in a huge amount of basic knowledge, okay, of MMT. So it's a good thing to read closely and read a few times to start getting some of the perspectives, okay, of MMT and how MMT is different from other things. Have I successfully shared this? Let me see. I think I've successfully shared it. Yeah, looks like I've successfully shared it. Oh, I see. I see what's happened. I've been looking for the share in the wrong part of the screen. Because when you share an application, the sharing notification is at the bottom of your screen. When you share an internet page, it's at the top. So that's why I didn't notice it was properly sharing. So here's a preface to this piece, by Randy, which actually summarized it fairly well. It says, MMT has been frequently mentioned in recent media. And he refers to it here as modern money theory. He prefers that use as opposed to what to the middle word actually being expressed as monetary theory. Most people say monetary, but Randy is never like that. He refers to money theory instead. In fact, he wrote a primer, on that kind of theory, again referring to it, as money theory. So he says, MMT has been frequently mentioned in recent media, first as crazy talk that if followed would bankrupt the nation, and then after the COVID-19 pandemic hit, as a way to finance an emergency response. In recent months, however, Washington seems to have returned to the old view that government spending must be paid for with new taxes. This raises the question, has MMT really made headway with policymakers? This e-pamphlet examines the extraordinary interview given recently by Representative John Yarmouth, chair of the House Budget Committee, in which he explicitly adopts an MMT approach to budgeting. By Chairman Yarmouth also lays out a path for realizing the major elements of President Biden's proposals. Finally, Ray summarizes a recent presentation he gave to the Congressional Budget Office's macroeconomic analysis section that urged reconsideration of the way that fiscal policy impacts are assessed. That, of course, is a favorite subject, of MMT. Now we get into the paper itself. Over the past couple of years, MMT has been in the headline and only goes through the crazy talk again. He points out there have been 4, yes, count them, 4 resolutions in the House and Senate condemning MMT as a threat to the nation. Admittedly, all pushed by those on the Republican side of the aisle. Crazy talk. That's real crazy talk, right? However, I don't mean MMT, of course. I mean on the Republican side of the aisle. However, after the pandemic hit, MMT was embraced as an emergency policy to quickly inject, well, MMT is not a policy, of course, which Randy knows extremely well, but it was embraced as a policy. In other words, that meant that policies, were enacted which referred to some of the verbiage of MMT to justify them. Embraced as an emergency policy to quickly inject $5 trillion of stimulus into the economy. While still considered dangerous by many, this was seen as a necessary response to save the economy from the ravages of COVID-19. The notion was that once the trough was reached, sane policy would return. President Biden, however, has recognized that the new normal will not look like your granddad's normal. We face multiple pandemics, viruses that are mutating, climate change, intransigent poverty and inequality, A healthcare system that did not live up to the COVID-19 challenge and that is ill-prepared for the next health crisis, inadequate access to affordable higher education, an antiquated infrastructure, and a climate-driven refugee crisis. He also recognizes that tackling these issues come with a high price tag, specifically trillions of dollars. Yet surprisingly, for the first time in nearly 2 generations, President Biden has not been completely stymied by the cost. He is the first president to clearly embrace the reality that the United States can and should openly talk about spending in multiple dollar amounts followed by 9 zeros. Unfortunately, as Bhagyevan Narsisian and I have explained elsewhere, that is in a paper by she and Randy, he has resurrected the idea of pay-fors linked to that spending. MMT was only for the relief packages, not for, quote, building back better, unquote, requiring tax hikes to match the spending. Before I go on, Randy has a footnote here to the people who called MMT crazy talk. Bill Gates, Larry Fink referred to MMT as garbage. Ken Rogoff, who completely screwed up the response on the part of many European countries to the crash of 2009, had the nerve to refer to MMT as nonsense when MMT people were right about what should happen in response to the crash of 2009, and Ken Rogoff was dead wrong, and countries that took his advice suffered, brutally suffered. He was dead wrong, should have been drummed out of the profession, actually made spreadsheet errors to create findings that underlay his terrible advice. And here he is calling MMT crazy talk. Ken Rogoff is crazy talk. Larry Summers claimed that the left's embrace of MMT would be a disaster, unquote. And the Nikkei staff read Larry Summers, the guy who advocated austerity during the Obama administration. Hey, the guy who refused to put a $1.8 trillion bill that was advocated for by the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, Christine Roma, who refused to put that bill in front of Obama because it was more than $1 trillion bill. As a result, partly as a result of that, partly as a result of Obama's own idiocy, we had the longest recovery in history to the crash of 2008. Thanks to Larry Summers. And he had the nerve to say the left's embrace of MMT would be a disaster. And he's still saying that. He's still advocating for not spending what should be spent. Then there was the Nikkei staff writers reported the Bank of Japan rejects MMT. From an alternative view, Monteiro, who critically analyzes why everyone hates MMT, quote unquote, arguing, quote, for me, an economic approach must help me understand the world and provide me with some useful insights, preferably about my day job investing. On those measures, let me assure you that MMT thrashes neoclassical economics hands down, unquote. And then Randy quotes some other folks who find it is very useful. So I won't read the rest of those footnotes, but we'll go on to the next page. Anyway, to continue with that last sentence. MMT was only for relief, not for building back better, requiring tax hikes to match the spending. MMT disagrees, says Randy. According to MMT, fiscal policy should be functional. That is, it should achieve the public purpose. There it is again. MMT is about the public purpose. The public purpose is a value-laden term, folks. It means different things to different people. So it should be functional, should achieve the public purpose, not formulated with a view to balancing the budget. Assuming, in other words, Randy is assuming, I agree with the assumption, that balancing the budget has nothing to do with public purpose, not at the federal level. The balanced budget view is enshrined in current congressional policy too, particularly due to the 2010 statutory Pay-As-You-Go Act, which, by the way, was enacted with the support and full blessing of Barack Obama. And the 2011 Budget Control Act, again, with the full blessing of Barack Obama, that essentially require any fiscal policy that would increase spending or lower tax revenues be offset by other changes to spending or taxes. But tying tax hikes to spending is like tossing barbells to a drowning swimmer, says Randy. With MMT in the headlines, one of the questions always raised by reporters is this: has MMT really made any headway in Washington except on the fringes? For example, Congresswoman AOC and a few others have invoked MMT and declined to play the pay-for game. MMT appears to have been a one-hit wonder used to justify COVID-19 relief. Yet there is some evidence that leads to a more optimistic assessment of MMT's success. In the fall of 2019, I was invited by Representative John Yarmouth's office, he's a Democrat in the Kentucky 3rd Congressional District, to testify on budget deficits before the House Budget Committee. Previously to and after the hearing, I was told by the congressman as well as his staff that at least the Democrat side of the committee was genuinely interested in and actively considering the MMT approach to fiscal policy. It turned out that was true on the Democrat side, but the Republican side merely parroted talking points proclaiming that the U.S. federal government ought to balance its books just like any household or firm, and that MMT's prescriptions would lead to rack and ruin. More recently, I was also asked to make a long presentation to the Congressional Budget Office's Macroeconomic Analysis Section, CBO, that is responsible for providing long-term 30-year budget and economic projections to the Congress. The baseline projections are constrained to be made under current law. Have you ever heard of anything so silly? 30-year budget projections? These guys and gals, can't project 6 months ahead. They create a projection in February, 4 months into a particular fiscal year, and they have to revise it in May or June. Only 3 months before the end of the fiscal year. That's how good their projections are. So there's supposed to be something that's at all accurate about their 30-year projections? It's ridiculous, folks. It's a ritual, a religious ritual. A religious ritual of the balanced budgeteers. That's what it's about. So, the baseline projections are constrained to be made under current law. That current law implies growing primary deficits and debt, both in absolute terms and as a share of the projected GDP, especially in the latter 2 decades. The pay-go and scoring requirements Congress imposes on itself means the CBO must assess whether policy will increase the deficit above the baseline, meaning more borrowing. They specifically wanted me to address the implications for the trajectory of interest rates and the burden and sustainability of that borrowing through time. They warned me they used the ridiculous infinite horizons intergenerational approach popularized by Larry Kotlikoff. However, they assured me I'm not going to make comments about Larry Kotlikoff. And Bonnie asks, who's that? He's an economist who does not deserve to wear the red berets. I will say that much. Anyway, however, they assured me the audience was interested in the MMT approach, that the reception would be cordial. I gave my presentation on May 19th, 2021, with questions and answers, lasting about 90 minutes, and with an audience of perhaps 75 staff members. Are they all 75? Are they macroeconomists, all of them? They got an army of macroeconomists there. Too many to be effective. Too many to be effective. If you're trying to have a team that does something major in software, it's got to be about 6 people. If it goes above 6 people, it's getting counterproductive. But this is government, you know. The questions were indeed serious and respectful. I know that the CBO also asked another prominent MMT proponent to give a presentation. I can only venture a guess as to who that was. However, the best evidence to date that MMT is making some inroads is the astonishing interview that Yarmouth gave to C-SPAN. The full transcript is well worth reading. The context for the interview is the prospects for President Biden's 2022 budget request, which of course contains his proposals for building back bigger, quote unquote. I thought it was building back better, but I guess maybe he thinks bigger is better. Anyway, the conventional view is that will be a very difficult slog, especially through the Senate, where Republicans are expected to oppose any tax hikes or spending that will significantly increase the deficit, and with 2 Democrats likely to join them. Even if the Democrats can coalesce, the filibuster threat would make it very difficult for Biden to get what he wants. There's been a lot of talk about pushing additional spending through during the reconciliation process, but that appears to many pundits to be unlikely. In this interview, Yarmouth makes it clear he is optimistic Congress will pass whatever they can pass, and much of the rest will make it through a reconciliation. Randy says the interview is a breath of fresh air for 2 reasons. Yarmouth's political optimism is a change of pace from many years of depressing hopelessness, and his penetrating focus on the issues that matter represents a breakthrough. Can the long nightmare of fiscal austerity be coming to an end? Question mark. Asks Randy Ray. I'll first focus on the main points made by Yarmouth, showing how they are consistent with MMT. Then I'll turn to the issues I tackled in my CBO presentation. So Yarmouth nicely summarized the main understanding he developed from his study of MMT. Historically, what we've always done is said, what can we afford to do, quote unquote? And that's not the right question. The right question is, quote, what do the American people need us to do, unquote? Isn't that the right question, folks? Someone finally asked the right question in the Congress. Yarmouth goes on, and that question becomes the first question. Once you answered that, then you say, quote, how do you resource that need, unquote? Resource that need. And to clarify what he meant by resource, quote unquote, he focused on capacity. Notice, not on money, on capacity. So Yarmouth says, so, for instance, there's a $225 billion investment in child care in the American Families Plan. But you can't just say we're going to give $225 billion to people to pay for their child care because there's not enough capacity. So what you do, hypothetically, that is, you'd make a false promise to the people, and then you would drive the price of existing child care even higher. So what you have to do instead is spend part of that money on building capacity so that there is enough child care to actually service the people who need it. What a concept, folks. What a concept.
Does that mean lie first and then?
Oh no, he's saying don't lie first. He's saying that would be the way it was previously done. Just spend it, not pay attention to the fact that there's not enough capacity, make a false promise to people, and then drive the price of existing childcare even higher so that you can't do it. But he said, so what you have to do is spend part of that money in building capacity so that there is enough childcare to actually service the people who need it. Randy says, this is precisely what I was trying to emphasize to the CBO. Rather than focusing on possible impacts on the infinite horizons deficit that will result from a spending proposal, the CBO should be focused on the increased demand for resources that might cause inflation. But wait a minute, said the reporter, quote, we can just print more money and there are no consequences, unquote. So Yarmouth said, there would be consequences if there is too much inflation. So let me give you a hypothetical. We could say that, quote, we're going to give every American family a $200,000 voucher to buy a house, unquote. We could create money to do that, but what would happen? Well, there's not enough housing, so the prices of existing houses would be through the roof. No pun intended. And again, you'd be creating a false promise. Meanwhile, you drive up the housing market to unsustainable levels. So there is a limit as to how much money we can inject into the economy, says Yarmouth, which is exactly what Randy would have said if he would have been making that comment. Randy goes on, that is without causing inflation. The problem is not the money, but rather the demand on resources. The key is to ramp up capacity as we rebuild our economy along socially and environmentally sustainable paths, and to phase in the spending on a pace with growth of capacity. Precisely what Biden's plan will do in Yarmouth's review. And Yarmouth says, if you're going to spend money at the federal level, if you're going to make investments, they need to be meaningful and important investments, and they have to actually add to the economic capacity of the economy, and that's what I think the American Rescue Plan and the American Families Plan do. We can't just throw money at worthless projects. Biden's proposals will increase capacity, which attenuates any inflation pressure. In response to questions about the trillions we need, Yarmouth argued, we can afford it because we determine how much money is in the system at the federal level. The federal government is not like any other user of currency, not like any household, any business, any state or local government. We issue our own currency, and we can spend enough to meet the needs of the American people. The only constraint being that we do have to worry about inflation from that spending. I have to say, I don't think that's the only constraint. I think we have to worry about the negative consequences of that spending, all manner of negative consequences. For example, the $3.5 trillion bill could have been about giving all sorts of money to the rich. That probably would not be very inflationary, but it would be it wouldn't be very inflationary because they don't spend much. However, it would be very bad for inequality in the United States and would further strengthen the oligarchy in the United States. Bonnie wants to say something to me. Bonnie, what do you want to say?
What do you think Pelosi was doing?
That's what Pelosi does. That's what Pelosi does. She strengthens the oligarchy. She's all about strengthening the oligarchy, especially her own family. Absolutely. But the point is, that would be a negative consequence that you have to worry about in any spending, in addition to inflation. There are many other negative consequences. For example, you could spend money on the fossil fuel people and create all kinds of negative effects for the environment as a result of that. So there are lots of constraints on spending inflation isn't the only one. As every American should know, this right of currency issue, now I'm going on with what Randy has to say. As every American should know, this right of currency issue was provided to Congress by the U.S. Constitution. Article 1, Section 8, folks. But won't the government eventually exhaust its fiscal capacity? A caller commented, quote, I do agree there is certainly a difference between households and the government itself. However, the government does have limits because the government doesn't have any more money than the people have. There are limited resources. And Yarmouth answered that by saying, in other words, this is a caller into the program Yarmouth was on. And so Yarmouth answered that by saying, let me go back to your one comment that, quote, we don't have any more money than the people have. Yes, we do. We do have the printing presses. I hate to use that term, printing money. I'm sorry you use that, John. But we do. And if you think about it, we have been accumulating debt in the United States for most of our 230-year history. Well, yes, but accumulating debt isn't the same thing as printing money, is it? I mean, maybe in our country it is because we issue debt when we want a deficit spend, yes, but we don't have to do that. We don't have to do that. How did we do that? I'm going on with Yarmouth's quote now. How did we do that? That's because the government issued a lot of money over time, and nobody has ever been asked to pay off any of that national debt. We've been able to finance our debt when we needed to, and I think it will remain that way. Again, the constraint on us is rampant inflation. This is correct. The danger isn't national insolvency, but excess demand on the nation's resources. A couple of questions right. It's not national insolvency. It's not fiscal unsustainability. It is excess demand on our resources, as Randy says. A couple of questions were raised about the inflation signs we were already seeing. Isn't Congressman Yarmouth concerned? In his response, he addressed both the current recovery as well as the future prospects. Quote from Yarmouth again. So again, you've got to realize these are numbers that are very large, of course, but they're spread out over a number of years. Yes, I think it's 8 years they're spread out over. 3.5 trillion, okay, over 8 years. That's only about, what, 450 billion a year or something like that, or just off the top of my head. That's why I think the Fed chair and others have said, and I'm quoting again from Yarmouth, we have the fiscal space to do this because injecting this over a period of time will not cause the kind of inflation that is dangerous, unquote. Well, I do not like the framing here, says Randy. Sovereign governments do not really borrow their own currency. We'll talk about that later, folks. Congressman Yarmouth is on the right track when he argues that there is nothing wrong with spending in excess of tax revenue. Quoting from Yarmouth again, we've been borrowing money to service the country, to serve the people of this country for 230 years. We'll continue to do that because the needs are more than we choose to tax our citizens. And the money we have, if we relied on taxation, purely on taxation to fund the government, then a lot of people would suffer very, very seriously because we could not provide nearly the services the American people want us to provide. And Randy goes on, trying to squeeze more tax revenue out of the economy would simply reduce private spending, increase the people's need for more government services. In addition, we need to address the implication of the government's balance on the balances of other sectors, a point I'll return to below. The answer is to spend more without taxing more in order to utilize existing idle resources and to add to the nation's capacity. So that's critical, folks. The answer is to spend more without taxing more in order to utilize existing idle resources and to add to the nation's capacity. What about the mountains of government debt? Says Randy. Who will hold it? And who is going to pay it all back? Many people think the United States must rely on Chinese willingness to lend us the dollars. Interest rates will have to rise, the dollar might crash, and that debt is going to burden America's grandkids, the grandkiddies. Yarmouth says, now, so many people say that we have so much debt, and our grandchildren, it is going to be on their backs and so forth. That is not the way it works. And I think the American people need an education about how the monetary system does work. I remember going back, but Greta, he's talking to the interviewer whose name is Greta. I remember going back, Greta, to when Paul Ryan was chair of the budget committee, and even before that, and that all of these forecasts of gloom and doom about, quote, oh, we're going to accumulate so much debt and interest rates are going to crowd out all of the spending, unquote. Well, we basically doubled the national debt from the recession in 2009 until last year before the pandemic. And none of the things that people warned would happen, happened. We didn't have the inflation. We had record low interest rates rather than higher interest rates, and the dollar was trading with normal levels vis-a-vis other currencies. So I think a lot of economists have begun to say, wait a minute, maybe we have been thinking about debt in the entirely wrong way, unquote. Randy says, precisely. And what about the Chinese holdings? And Yarmouth says in reply, okay, I'm glad you asked that question. China owns roughly 1 trillion, roughly, of U.S. treasuries. That's it. If they said they wanted $1 trillion instead of $1 trillion of treasuries, we would put $1 trillion on their account, and that would be fine. And they could do with that whatever they wanted. They could leave it here. They could take it home. We can do that with anybody. The emphasis on China owning our debt is way overplayed. Of course, again, it's a fraction. It's less than 5% of the debt. Well, that's one good point about it. Okay, the other good point is it doesn't matter what percent of our debt, it is. We can still do that. We can still put down whatever it is we owe, if someone wants that, just by creating the money to convert our debt into dollars. Randy says, below, I will tackle foreign ownership of Treasury debt in more detail. But how will you get this spending package through a divided Congress? Asks by Randy. Asked, do you suspect the president's 2 infrastructure proposals also make it into the budget, unquote? Yarmouth responded with an outline of the process he envisions to shepherd through the Biden plan. Well, what we're doing is we're assuming there will be no bipartisan deal on infrastructure in the Senate. So we're proceeding as if all of the American Jobs Plan and all the American Families Plan will be in the reconciliation instructions that we send to the Senate, that we instruct our own committees to do. But if they come up with a bipartisan deal, let's say it is 1 trillion or almost $1 trillion, we would take that out of the reconciliation instructions. So neither process precludes the other. We hope that the Senate does reach a bipartisan agreement on what we think of as hard infrastructure, and let the rest of it be done by reconciliation. That, of course, is in fact what happened. The Senate reached agreement on the $1.2 trillion bill with $550 billion in new spending and a lot of giveaways to the private sector, a lot of graft, a lot of lemon socialism in that particular bill. So Yarmouth says, I think if there's a bipartisan deal on the Republican version of infrastructure, which is roads, bridges, water systems, broadband, airports, and ports, but not human infrastructure, there's a bipartisan deal on that. We will pass it with a great deal of satisfaction. Not so fast, John. And I hope they do that. But all of the rest of what we call infrastructure, the human infrastructure part, things like 2 years of early childhood education, which in my opinion is the most important thing we can do for the future besides deal with climate change. What happened to Medicare for all, John? Elder care, a lot of those issues, which will have to be done by reconciliation, by the budget process. It's potentially a parallel process. But yes, if we get a bipartisan deal, we'd be happy with that. We'll do the rest of it by reconciliation. If we don't get a bipartisan deal, we'll do it all by reconciliation. Unquote. Randy then says, while it's too early to tell if Congressman Yarmouth is overly optimistic, there has been some progress made on the hard infrastructure programs, with many Republicans breaking ranks and supporting a significant amount of spending. There has been, however, pushback on the pay-fors, with Republicans refusing to even close the loopholes that wealthy individuals and corporations use to avoid taxes. So there are the Republicans who don't believe in MMT, don't believe in deficit spending, but of course they believe even less in paying for things. So they don't want to pay for things with taxes. So where they want to spend $1.2 trillion, they always do it through deficit spending. While they rant and rave about the Democrats wanting to do things through deficit spending, and they make the Democrats go through reconciliation, which has to have pay-fors in it, because that's what's necessary for reconciliation. This whole thing is a lot of nonsense, of course. You understand it's Washington nonsense, right? Randy says, in the next section, I turn to the arguments I made before the CBO, trying to push them to consider a point of view very similar to that adopted by John Yarmouth in this interview. So here we go to the CBO presentation. Obviously, I'm not going to get through the whole of the paper tonight. I will stop with the parts that I'm now going through in about 15 minutes and take your questions. But in this section, I will quickly summarize the main points I made in my presentation to the CBO, says Randy. My goal was to outline the MMT approach and deal with the usual fears surrounding deficits and debt, solvency and sustainability, interest rate effects, and inflation potential. I then promoted an alternative way to approach the problem of dealing with multiple pandemics that threaten national and even human survival. It will be obvious that many of Congressman Yarmouth's views are consistent with MMT. Okay, the next sentence. MMT provides a framework for analyzing a sovereign currency system, one in which the national government chooses a money of account, issues its own currency denominated in the money of account. Okay, what is the money of account in the United States? It's the dollar. That's the money of account. It issues its own currency denominated in the money of the account, US dollars, imposes an obligation to pay tax payable in its currency, our income taxes, our sales taxes. Okay. And if it issues other debt, the obligations are payable in its currency. So Randy then says something very important. This implies a floating currency. What's a floating currency? It implies the currency is exposed to free fluctuations on international markets. The currency is allowed to float. The government of a monetary sovereign does not do anything to strengthen or weaken its currency. It just allows the value of its currency to float in the international markets. And why does it do this? Why does it imply a floating currency? Because otherwise, the government would be committed to delivering something else in payment other than its own currency. What are the implications? The government cannot run, in other words, if the currency were pegged to something else, then the government would be committed to accepting their currency in trade for that other thing. In other words, that would become the ultimate means of payment and not its own currency. Randy asks, what are the implications? Well, the government cannot run out of its own currency. It cannot be forced into involuntary default and can make all payments as they come due. It is not financially constrained, but rather faces resource constraints. This was Yarmouth's view as he focused on the inflation potential of spending rather than on the supposed financial constraints that we face. So, note, this paragraph gives a definition, really, gives a characterization, which is a definition, okay, of what a sovereign currency is, what the requirements are for a sovereign currency. The national government chooses a money of account. The national government issues its own currency denominated in the money of account. The national government imposes an obligation payable in its currency to drive the value of that currency. And if it issues other debt, if it sells debt instruments, in other words, if it sells treasury securities, the obligations can only be payable in its currency. And then, of course, the implication, the currency has to be allowed to float. Because otherwise, the government would be committed to delivering something besides its own currency in payment. And then the implications of having a sovereign currency, the government cannot run out of its own currency, can't be forced into involuntary default. It can be forced into voluntary default. For example, the Japanese government, towards the end of the Second World War, okay, in a final act of resistance, okay, to its enemies, it defaulted on all its debts. It didn't have to because it was a sovereign currency, but it defaulted, okay, on all its debts. Okay, but that was a voluntary default. Something interesting, Russia, during the 90s, its currency was going crazy on the international markets. What it did was, in that situation, it defaulted on its debts. It defaulted on its debts, even though it wasn't forced into default. And by the way, Warren Mosler lost quite a bit of money on that. He was not himself responsible for investments in the ruble at that time because other people had taken over his company, and he was a passive investor, okay, at that time. But he had earned a huge amount of money when Italy got into a similar situation. I forget when it was, in 1994, 95, 92, I forget exactly the date. And the Italians simply resisted the pressure from the international market and simply said, all debts will be paid as promised when they fall due, okay, in our currency. And the financial crisis was over for Italy at that point because they took Warren's advice. Warren made them see. And Warren made $300 million on that deal because he bet on Italian currency. He bought Italian currency because he knew that they didn't have to default. Anyway, his successors in his own company, tried to play the same game with the Russians. But Putin and screwed up the investment, and Warren lost $100 million on that deal. Even though he himself is not responsible for it, he was a passive investor in his own company, of course. So he took a real bath on that. I may have the figures wrong. He may have lost more than $100 million. But anyway, kind of reminds me of the baseball story. Sometimes the sun shines, but sometimes it rains. How does that go? You know how it goes. Anyway, the government cannot run out of its own currency, cannot be forced into involuntary default, and can make all payments as then come due. It is not financially constrained. but rather faces resource constraints. I would say it faces resource constraints and consequential constraints as well, but not financial constraints. So, this is quite different from the conventional view that Yarmouth referred to as the wrong way. We have been taught to think about it based on the old loanable funds view that saving is the source of finance. Okay, what that means is that the loanable funds view is that there are a whole bunch of savings out there, and that they represent a market of loanable funds, and that you can get your financing from there, that if you issue federal debt, you're going to dry up the loanable funds market and drive interest rates way up. You're going to crowd out investment in the private sector because the loanable funds market, okay, is going to drive out. So the basic view there was that there was a scarce resource of savings. That resource was allocated by interest rates, which, by the way, is a view locked into the methodology used by the CBO. The CBO even today believes in crowding out when there's no crowding out. Why is there no crowding out? Because the funds banks lend don't come from any savings market or loanable funds market. They are created out of thin air on the spot. Loans create deposits in banks. That's the way the banks really operate. They don't operate taking savings from any external market. They create their funds using the authorities that have been given to them as part of the Federal Reserve System. Anyway, according to that view, as government borrows more to spend, that pushes up interest rates, reducing investment and possibly appreciating the dollar and causing a trade deficit. That's the old twin deficits argument that was popular in the Reagan years. The United States becomes reliant on, quote, foreign savings, unquote, to, quote, finance, unquote, its trade deficit that results from the living beyond its means, quote, unquote. In turn, the federal government needs foreign savings to finance its budget deficit. Budget and trade deficits threaten solvency and create debt burdens. The United States could become a Ponzi nation, borrowing just to pay interest, which is ultimately unsustainable due to growth of debt without any limits. The conventional view is that in normal times, government should tax. Well, I think I'm going to stop, okay, exactly here. Okay, what I've been just stating now is the conventional view of how things happen. There's more on the conventional view here. After Randy states the conventional view, he goes on to state the contrary MMT view, which has been proven right by history and by facts. And I will get to that the next time that I talk about this really great paper, which has a lot of basic stuff in it, okay, to learn. But for now, I'm going to leave off that. But you can see what's going on here. Randy is giving you basically a review of the basics of MMT while he reports on the success of MMT in getting into heads in the government at various key agencies like the House Budget Committee, okay, and the CBO, and some of the other federal agencies which have now taken up the serious study, okay, of MMT. So that's going to finish what I have to say for tonight. I'll get back to that at some time in the future when I don't have any interviews to do. I hope you liked that. There are still 15 of you here, so I guess you did kind of like it. So that's good. I'm going to go back to the beginning now, and I'm going to take your comments. Joy asks, I hope you have good news. Well, I don't know. Did I have any good news? I don't know if I did. The MMT was good news, I think. Now, Alana says, I do not get any notification. Well, I explained that before, that I don't know why. Lana said, no, I meant YouTube should notify. I am a subscriber. Oh, thank you, Lana. Yeah, I don't know what YouTube is doing lately, but everybody remarks that YouTube doesn't do the notifications, and everybody advises like, share, and subscribe, and hit the bell, always, so people are notified. Carmen says Joe is MU, hashtag MU, a Latin alphabet letter. I don't know, Carmen. And Jeffrey Denton has offered an icon, which I can't see in my interface. Lana says, Carmen, do you mean Greek? Lana says, please remember to hit the like button. Yes, please remember to hit the like button, the share button, and the subscribe button. Jeffrey says, I need all the help I can get. I need to get to 1,000 subscribers. I'm way, way far away, but I can't be monetized, by YouTube until I get to 1,000 subscribers. I may not be monetized even afterwards, because they may be demonetizing me all the time for the incredibly discourteous way in which I do these live streams. On the other hand, I don't know if I'm as discourteous as many other folks who are doing live streams, so maybe I'll be able to get away with it. Jeffrey says, back to blindly believing the weapons of mass destruction, Russiagate media, because of a con man wrestling actor calling it fake. Only half the population of the country is even registered to vote. At half of those people identify as independent. Actually, more than half, isn't it? Identify as independent. How in the world is it okay for them not to question the government and the media that they know for a fact have lied to them? Yeah, what's wrong with people? Why does 1/8 of the population get to dictate what they think the truth is to people, or the other 8 that identifies as Republican? Well, you know all the answers to that question. I know all the answers to that question. We're trying to unwind the not now. We're having a great deal of, not having a great deal of success yet, but we're going to keep on trying. We're going to keep on making an honorable fight. Carmen Union says, hi, Lana. I didn't get a YouTube notification either. I'm a subscriber as well. Carmen says, yeah, I mean Greek, Lana. Laugh out loud. Damn ADD. Kay says, New Zealand also has single-payer healthcare. You betcha they do. Australia has single-payer healthcare too. Australia's done pretty well on COVID also, but not near as well as but New Zealand has done. They're running something like 40 deaths per million, as opposed to 5 deaths per million. So they're running about 8 times worse than New Zealand. Of course, we seem to be operating at 500 times worse than New Zealand, roughly, or at least 400 times worse than New Zealand. Go-Start says, Democratic solution for COVID homelessness is jail / death. God, I hope not, Steve. Lana says, Carmen, I don't get it. I get YouTube notifications for lots of other stuff. Maybe they're biased against me, Lana. And Lana says, hi, Steve, go start. And Lana says, I like by Rosa DeLauro, and your Supreme Court mostly sucks. I am sorry to say. Yes, I like Rosa too. If you recall, she was one of my potential candidates for Speaker to replace Nancy Pelosi. She was one of the people that I mentioned that I thought would be a big improvement. Kay says, one good thing about being an old woman, but laugh out loud. Oh, really? What's that? And Lana says, our Supreme Court. Lana says, I hate this keyboard. Amber says, laws don't stop abortion. It just takes any safety net, just takes away any safety net for a safe medical procedure. That's quite true. Women, especially young women, will still seek out other options, as they have always done, going out of state, self-abortion, or to the growing black market that comes, okay, with making it illegal. I have a long story. I don't have time to tell, but I did have a little bit of an experience with that by proxy. Once, when I was young, okay, in undergraduate school, okay, I had two friends, okay, who were going together, and they got pregnant, okay, or that is, one of the two friends got pregnant by the other of the two friends. And so they wanted to have an abortion. And this was back in, what was it?
60s?
No, it must have been 1957 or 1958. I think it was 1957, as I recall. And basically, when they went for the abortion, they took me along for moral support. Let me tell you, that was one hell of an experience. I won't say any more than that, but boy, that was really something. Lana says, wow, there's a tattletale line in this law. Yeah, there's a tattletale. Carmen says, my keyboard has bugs or something too. Kay says, before Roe, hospitals used to call it a DNC, a dilation and curettage. I think they still call it a dilation, okay, and curettage, don't they? Technical term. Kay says, these days people have no health care though. Bonnie says, hi everyone. Hi Bonnie.
Hi.
And Lana says, glad you are covering Powell. I saw that headline but didn't have a chance to read it through. Who do they want to replace him? It is Lyle Brainard. Who do we want to replace him? Jamie Galbraith or Sarah Bloom Raskin? Jeffrey Denton says, I just don't get why there's no honest, open, transparent debate allowed, and nobody wants to discuss how much disinformation on both imaginary or whatever sides of the people who each think that half the country is their enemy, while half of the country isn't even registered to vote. FFs. I think the reason there's no honest, open, and transparent debate is because the media has long since decided to outlaw such debates and to create fairy tales instead, thinking that the fairy tales are more profitable. Kay says, Beto and friends are getting people registered to vote all over Texas. Well, they better, but they're still going to suppress the vote in various ways. They're still going to create all kinds of frauds with the drop boxes and not allowing voting on certain days. And at the end of it all, they will have a law that gives the state legislature the right to overturn elections. You know that's what they're angling to do. Jeffrey Denton says politicians who take unlimited dark super PAC money are allowed in the media, also on television. Actually, progressive politicians who don't take unlimited, legalized bribery are not allowed in the media whatsoever. Lana says, ugh, Larry the loser. And Steve says, Doc, you've been watching Fred Hampton leftists? No. The only one of the Fred Hampton leftists that I occasionally watch is Sabby Sabs too. Sometimes when she's on with some other people, I may see some of the other Fred Hampton leftists. But from what I've seen of them, well, I don't have much to say because I haven't watched them too often, so I'm not sure that I want to say anything. Kay says, I think Beto should run for governor in Texas. That would get people out to vote. Well, perhaps, but He ran for senator before, and they came out to vote, and Cruz still won. So there's no telling what's going to happen. Of course, it's better if people get out to vote. Lana says, love Dr. Randall Ray. Highly recommend short videos of his with Deficit Owls. Also, he's done a few podcasts on macro and cheese. Yes, on the last podcast, I say this unfortunately, he made Steve look like a fool when Steve was trying to put down state level stuff. But nobody seems to have recognized that he made Steve actually look like a fool, because maybe he was a little too subtle about it. But you should see that. It was the July 10th episode of Macro and Cheese. And he did make. He said they tried that already, Kay. He kept dancing on tables. And Kay says people are still trying. Amber says, I think modern money may be a better label, as MMT can be controversial on its face. Well, it's still MMT because it's, modern money theory. And that may be also controversial. I don't think you're going to avoid the controversiality of it with a minor change, in labeling. But I think from the beginning that Randy favored money as opposed to monetary. Lana says, isn't Rogoff an austerity monger too? Yes, exactly. His research supported the austerity rage in Europe, but following the crash of 2008. His research in 2009 and 2010 supported the austerity programs the neoliberals wanted to run, in Europe. So he was culpable, in large part, for the devastation that went on, as a result of that. And his results were based on spreadsheet errors and on methodological errors. And I and other people have spilled considerable electronic ink going after him on that. And Sherry Wise says Larry Summers is a disaster. Larry Summers is the master of disaster. And Ghost, that's an old line, of course. And Ghostart says, hi, Lana, sweetheart, plus everybody. And Larry Epstein says, what? And laugh out loud. Larry Summers. Ghostart says, Larry Summers on an island. Ghostart says, Larry Summers. As far as I know, there's no Larry Epstein I know. And Kay says, Obama sucks bad. Antonio says, great footnotes. Nobody likes to hear the truth about money. It is just paper with a value attached to the people who manages it. It's not just paper. It's electronic ink these days. From there, the importance of teaching people about money in MIT. Otherwise, we are left with paper only, or electronic ink only. And Carmen Muniz says, I'd say the Armour testimony was an MMT victory. Certainly, it was a victory for MMT education. Yes. And Lana says, yes, Larry needs to go on an island with Pelosi, Elon Musk, Bezos, Mitch, Obama, and Trump. A deserted island, all of their own, Gilligan Island type deal. And they can never come back, I think is what Lana meant to say. I'd be quite happy for that, but they could fight among themselves, and we could see who would win. My money would be on Pelosi.
Didn't Trump's daughter buy an island?
I think they did. I think they bought an island near Florida.
Yeah.
But I think the island may be underwater.
Might
be underwater before too long. Antonio says, tell me that. And Ghostart says, the only cure for shit libberish is turd immunity. Oh, God, Steve.
Oh,
Antonio says, they project They project shutdowns. They project anything. Kay says they should tax the hell out of the rich anyway. They need to pay too. That's true.
Yes.
Lana says, yeah, who was Larry Kotlikoff? Okay, another loser, Larry. He's an economist who is best known for his boosting of a discipline known as intergenerational accounting. What it has tried, to prove is that there are intergenerational financial constraints on government spending. His work has been debunked for years and years and years now. In fact, I saw a report, it was from Levy, actually, reprinting testimony that was given by Jamie Galbraith and Warren Mosler and Randy Ray back in 2009 and 2010, debunking intergenerational accounting. In other words, it's a beautiful critique of intergenerational accounting, and in particular, Larry Kotlikoff's work. And if you go back to some of my earlier blogs, I have a few things to say about Larry Kotlikoff also in those blogs. That's like circa 2010, 2011. I had some choice words about intergenerational accounting back then. Carmen says, those anal parents that made kids save all their money, well, those are the kids who are the balanced budgeteers now. And Lana says, Yarmouth is awesome. Carmen says, Yarmouth for Prezzo 24. And Antonio says, the great hearing with Purdue and Mnuchin. They explain how to pay in a banker's approach context, explore longer maturities because there's enough room to underwrite. They were on a spending path. Which Purdue you're talking about, then Senator Purdue? And Evelina Pont says, sorry, a bit late, but here now. Hello all. Hi, Evelina. Steve Wolfbrand says, the churches too. Steve Wolfbrand says, hi, Evelina. Kay says, hi, Evelina. Lana says, I say hi, Evelina too. Lana says, awesome info. I watched this live, was cheering at the TV for a change. Couldn't believe he was saying this on national TV, C-SPAN, #Learn MMT, so that we can unite for a New Deal. Not only that, he was also pushing, or as he said, he was flacking Stephanie's book, or flogging. I forget what he said, flacking or flogging. Stephanie's book. And Kay says, if churches do nothing to help the poor and just hang on to their wealth, they should be taxed. Kay says, churches could help the homeless crisis by setting up tiny housing communities, ECR. Not sure what ECR means, but there it is. Jeffrey Denton says, pretty bad form to drop a second bomb on Nagasaki. There was absolutely no honor in that. Yes, I'm not sure there was any honor in dropping the first bomb either, but, there was no honor in it. That's all. I'm not even going to try to excuse it. There was no honor in it. Okay. And Lana says, sorry. Scroll down. I'm back to Lana. Every loan that I have approved that goes to closing is funded by all new dollars via FedWire. As you say, quote, out of thin air, no one calls the branches to see if there are enough deposits, if there are enough reserves held by the bank. Why is that not the way things work? It doesn't work because if at the end of the day, the bank is short of reserves, it goes into the interbank market and it just borrows what it needs to borrow. If the interbank market, for some reason, and it borrows at the federal funds rate. If the interbank market is somehow frozen for a change because there's some kind of economic crisis going on, then what happens is it goes to the Federal Reserve the loan window. There's a loan window they can go to get some new reserves at only a very little above the federal funds rate. Oh, it's called the discount window. I'm sorry. So they go to the discount window and they get the reserves they need to meet the requirements. In other words, there are actually requirements for reserves to back loans. I'm not sure what it is now. It may be 3% or something like that. It used to be 10%. And all of the examples given in economics books, suggesting, okay, there's a there's a money multiplier that concerns that as opposed to a fiscal multiplier. They always use the example of 10%, banks needing 10% to back up any loan failures. Well, there is a requirement. I'm not sure what it is now. I think it's 3%. But if that requirement is exceeded, in other words, if banks don't have 3% of the amount of loans they have out, and they need some more reserves to get to the 3%, of reserves, all they do is go into the interbank market, in the discount window, and they get that. But the key point is they get that after they made the loans, not before. So that is not a constraint on lending, at all. It's not a constraint on lending. It's thought to be by the neoclassicists, but it is not a constraint on lending because it happens post hoc, not pre hoc, post hoc, propter hoc, the old expression. I'm never sure what the hell that means. Carl Munis says, love the content tonight, Joe. Short and sweet. Thank you, Carmen. Ghostart says, the only time politicians tell the truth is when they're calling each other corrupt. Jeffrey Denton says, we can start sharing the YouTube instead of just the Facebook when Dolores and I are spreading it around, and I start to spread it around. That would be great, Jeff. That would help. Steve Wolfbrand says, what's Jeffrey's channel so we can subscribe? So, Jeffrey, what's your own channel? Ghostart says, hit the bell, hashtag, that's what she said. Jeffrey Denton says, type it into your search engine. 116 countries of various sizes, populations, and GDPs have sorry, gotta drink something. Have universal health care. Lana says, Steve, ring the bell, laugh out loud. And Lana says, Alpha, Beta, Lambda, Delta, Nu. I can't remember. I can't either. I can remember Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zion, Ches, Tes, Yud. I can remember all that stuff. But I can't remember Alpha, Beta, Lambda, Delta, Nu. I never got into that deep. And Steve Wolfbrand said, Doc, can you get on Robin? Everyone is going there. I think it's Rockfin you're talking about. Yes, I suppose I can, but
Would people follow you?
I would then have to build a following there among people who are on Rockfin. And I don't think there are that many people on Rockfin yet. Kostat says, you can ring my bell. That is ring my bell. And Jeff says, World Population Review, country rankings, countries with universal health care. Thank you, Jeff. Kay says, Texas anti-abortion law makes it better to be old, but right now. And Steve says, Rockfin, sorry. And Ghostart says, they should start naming the variants after governors. Steve, that is one great idea. They should start naming the coronavirus variants after the governors. That would be hilarious. So I think the Delta variant should be called the Abbott variant, don't you? Or maybe the DeSantis variant. Jeff says, yes, since Trump called the media fake, all of the media magically started to tell the truth. Nah. And evidently, any government that doesn't have Trump in it, we can just magically trust now. Yeah, magically trust, sure. In the pig's eye. Ghostart says, is Bonnie wearing her hashtag med beret?
Not at the moment.
She says, not at the moment. And Steve Frost said, my girlfriend got an abortion in 1972. I still regret that, but we were young with no money. We did what we had to do. Yeah, that was the case for, actually for my two friends in 1957. As I said, I think it was 1957. They were young. They were going to Cornell. He was a physics major. But, okay, I forget what she was majoring in. Now, they were a very nice couple. Very, very nice couple. Anyway, there was a scene afterwards at her parents' house. We all drove back to New York, and she went to her parents' house. And her parents were both psychiatrists. And you can imagine the scene at her parents' house. It was something. Sherry Wise says, FYI, I put up a list of links to the sites I referred to last night, plus a few more things. They are in last night's chat list. But thank you, Sherry. That's great. Thank you very much for doing that. By the way, it was a terrific show last night. So thank you again for that as well. Kay says, I took my daughter in the 80s and it was awful. All the protesters were a pain. No one really wants to get an abortion, but what do you do? Take food out of the one you have to feed the new one. ABL says the kids have no money. Savings. Lauderdale says, but Steve, agree with naming the new variants after the rogue loose COVID policy governors. Way to go down in history, laugh out loud. Jeff says, I have a YouTube account, but I've never posted anything. I just watch. Hey, Jeff, one of these days you're coming on my show. Jeff says, it's all Greek to you if it's not Hebrew. I think that Hebrew may be Greek to me these days also. It's been a very long time. And Shane says, hey, Joe. Hey, Shane. How are you? Shane is KRTD Media. And National Hurricane Center is keeping its eye on the 12th named storm of the season, Tropical Storm Larry. Steve wrote an article about you, apparently. He wrote an article about me? I'm famous. Absolutely famous. He's still on the whole Washington thing. You think he wrote an article about me? Somebody wrote an article about me there, but I doubt if Steve wrote an article about me. He might have done a live stream about me. Have you the link to the article, Shane? And Lana says, hey, Shane. Kay says, thank you for another great discussion. I love you all. And we love you too, Kay. Thank you very much for coming. Okay, any other comments or questions or remarks? And Shane, please send me the link to the article if you've got it in the Facebook chat. And Carmen says, neoliberals are behind that, an abortion They want slave wage workers, especially now since so many young workers are dying from COVID. Lana says, down with Larry. Yeah, down with Larry is right. Laura says, thank you for a great discussion. Good night, all. And thank you all for coming. It was a good night. Russ says, hey, Russ Gorman, been listening and doing my bookkeeping. Hope you are well. We hope you're well, too. Yeah, we are well. We're doing very well. Of course, we facilitate that by staying in the house an awful lot. Carmen says, anti-abortion. And Lana says, good night. Good night, Lana. And I'm going to say good night, too, I think. And thank you again. And Shane says, hey, Lana. Good night, folks.